Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video I'd like to talk about the 1994 film Immortal Beloved. This movie is very much supposed to be a pseudo-biopic depicting the life of the renowned composer Ludwig van Beethoven, most especially throwing light on the posthumous letter he left behind proclaiming his one true love in life, whom he dubbed, as the title suggests, his immortal beloved. However, in attempting to deliberate on this point, the film derails and devolves into not much more than a kind of scandal-laden controversy, much more embracing the kind of pseudo-sensationalist contrivances of the more modern supermarket tabloids. This because it's not as if the intended recipient of Beethoven's affections has gone without legitimate historical debate. On the contrary, this topic has been long debated amongst scholars and students of history alike, wishing to trace back the lifeline of the maestro, going as far back as his literal moment of death. It's fairly interesting, with that in mind, just how much this film eschews the more historically accurate, more common sense-based solutions and suggestions to this ages-old quandary. That being that the most notable, most widely accepted recipient to the Immortal Beloved letter was Beethoven's on-again, off-again lover, the Countess Josephine Dame, aka Josephine Brunswick. It's not as if this film omits her entirely from the Beethoven story, but it significantly diminishes her role in his life as its first overall historical discrepancy. In fact, it pretty significantly dials back on the involvement both she and her sister Teresa had in his life. It rather plays relatively fast and loose with their appearances during significant events in Beethoven's life, including depicting them both at his funeral during the film's opening scene, when it's a very good probability that neither one of them was actually in attendance. And the list of these inaccuracies goes on and on and on, but are not limited to incorrectly depicting Anton Schindler as being the deliverer of Beethoven's eulogy at his funeral, to also Schindler's being so closely related to him in friendship, as the real-world history will tell you otherwise. The real-world Schindler, as it turns out, is better known to have actually falsified the contents of Beethoven's own personal diaries, as well as his conversation books, books of conversation written out due to his deafness, to meet the falsified claims of Schindler's own published biographies and memoirs about the composer. But what is probably the most abhorrent suggestion the film makes is that of its own proposed recipient for the Immortal Beloved letter, Beethoven's sister-in-law. The movie spends the bulk of its time getting us familiar with she as well as two other proposed intended recipients of the letter, neither of the three of which actually holds any real legitimacy insofar as how they're depicted in the film. This in an attempt to show us a Beethoven who's much more closely approaching a philanderer, which isn't altogether immediately untrue, but Beethoven wasn't exactly the suave Casanova the movie paints him out to be. The real Beethoven was relatively short in stature, had a tanned complexion and pockmarked face. While not exactly approaching ladies' man qualities, he still managed to conceive of several flings and relationships due mostly to his, for lack of a better term, rock star status. Alternatively, there is some truth to the fact, as depicted in the film, that in the wake of the death of his brother, Beethoven did indeed seek the guardianship of his nephew, and that a protracted case played out in the courts between he and his sister-in-law over the matter. It is also true that his nephew did at one time attempt suicide, which he actually survived. But you almost have to take all of these aspects of the maestro's life with a grain of salt in comparison to the table-flipping suggestion that Beethoven's greatest love of all was his brother's wife. The film makes every attempt to glorify this otherwise contrived scandal, altogether knowingly, as the film's own writer-director is on record as challenging any student of history to, quote, prove me wrong. And to me, this is the film's greatest failure, in how it dismantles the real-world history of one of its greatest contributors to artistic expression known to history, and slaps and pastes it back together in a contrived, overly melodramatic, and otherwise scandalous way. And with that said, it's not as if you can't actually see the reasoning behind it. Beethoven cared so much for his nephew, as is depicted in the film, to become his surrogate parent. So, what if he wasn't actually his nephew at all, but his real son? To which I have to say a resounding bah. No, the picture the movie paints of Beethoven's life, as well as the subject of his most heartfelt love, is sophomoric at best, which is actually quite the exceptional failing when you consider the overall production value of the film itself. From the costuming to the set design, the score, and even the casting, the likes of which include Gary Oldman, Isabella Rossellini, Valeria Golino, Jerome Crabb, and Joanna Ter Steeg, among others. Oldman being the singular reason to even dedicate yourself to actually giving this film a sit-through. All in all, I can definitively say this film is a thorough disappointment, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's more closely approaching an insult, a disservice to not only the man himself, but to anyone who considers themselves fans of his compositions, even to this day and age. And with that, I have to give a tremendous vote of thanks to my good friend Aurora Madariaga, a scholar in her own right in all things Beethoven, who was actually instrumental in helping me put together and accumulate all of the different discrepancies and historical inaccuracies that I wanted to bring forth in this discussion about this film. So with that, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.